Blindsight in monkeys. One thing about the perceptual reality monitoring theory is that it does not require language. In fact, the argument is that any brain capable of predictive coding could have something akin to an adversarial discriminator. But the theory does require that one is capable of some form of rational thinking, in particular, one's ability to form beliefs about the current world. This is because one of the main points of the theory is to account for why it makes sense for us to believe what we consciously perceive. That is, conscious perception happens when the adversarial discriminator classifies a sensory signal as representing the world right now for the rational thinking system. But some primates are certainly capable of relatively sophisticated reasoning, as well as predictive coding. Does that mean that monkeys are conscious, according to this theory? Turns out, monkeys can show blindsight-like behavior after the surgical removal of their primary visual cortex, V1. We can't ask these monkeys to say whether they consciously saw something, but we can set up experiments such that they pull a lever when a stimulus is presented. In addition to this kind of detection task, we can also have a discrimination task, in which the monkeys identify whether a stimulus was a left-tilted bar or a right-tilted bar by, for example, making saccades to different locations. Let's say that in the discrimination task, they have to make one of two responses. Since these are the only two options, we can essentially force the animal to make a guess. By analyzing their performance in the detection and discrimination tasks, we can see how their responses match those of human blindsight subjects. For example, if a monkey always responds negatively in a detection task, as though the stimulus isn't there, but did okay in the discrimination task when the options concern only what the stimulus was, this would strongly indicate that the monkey is blindsided. Furthermore, these experiments were typically done so that only one part of the V1 was removed, so that we can compare the performance in the blind field and the visual field region unaffected by the lesion. If the blindsight-like behavior is specific to the blind field, we can rule out whether or not the animal is just acting strangely in general. Multiple labs across the world have shown results like this, so we can say that blindsight probably does happen in monkeys. Some skeptics may still think that this isn't enough. Part of this is a reaction to other researchers who rather liberally apply human psychology to animals. For example, remember Ledoux's arguments against the possibility that rodents experience conscious fear. While it's true that rodents have an amygdala, their PFC, which are important for consciousness given the perceptual reality monitoring theory, are actually quite different from ours. And don't forget that our culture and concepts are most likely relevant for fear and other emotions, which is a lot more difficult to ascertain with mice and rats. All of this is to say that the alternative theory, that mice and rats might just be having unconscious reactions to threats rather than conscious emotions, is not so outlandish. The skeptics may actually have a point there. Contrast this with the case of the monkeys with the V1 lesions. If the monkey showed blindsight-like behavior in the blind field, but normal performance in the unaffected visual field, it would start to become more difficult for us to account for their behavior without invoking the concept of subjective experience. Just how else could we account for their behavior? How can it all be equally unconscious? Let's say if we further measured PFC activity in these monkeys, and we found that stimulus in the blind field leads to lowered activity in the PFC, interpreting this in the context of the perceptual reality monitoring theory and fMRI experiments in human blindsight subjects would be more evidence in favor of claiming that these monkeys have subjective experiences just as we do. Unfortunately, the experiment measuring PFC activity in monkeys with V1 lesions that I just described has not been done yet. But the point that we're hoping to make here is this. Deciding whether an animal is conscious like we are depends on many things. Ultimately, there is no one single proof. Like many scientific questions, we try to answer them through debate. Looking through the alternatives, we try to find the best answer. If we're inclined to think that monkeys are conscious, we should think, how do we make the skeptic look more unreasonable? What kind of new evidence can we collect to make our case stronger? It's a long game. Having a theory helps, but convincing your opponents that your theory is right can take a lot of work. Things only become clearer as we accumulate more and more evidence. It's a slow-moving process, but these are the things that matter, the things that last.